One sunny day in the happy village, a dark-skinned young man named Lucas was ecstatic, looking for the perfect gift for his little sister Bia. But as soon as he entered the jewelry store, his joy was abruptly interrupted by the suspicion of the saleswoman. When he accidentally dropped the bracelet, her suspicion turned into unfounded accusations. A few minutes later, the police arrived, blindly believing the words of the saleswoman, and handcuffed him. What they didn't know was that Lucas had a powerful ally, his mother, who was willing to change things in ways no one expected. It was a hot Saturday in the happy village, a quiet town where life flowed at a measured pace. Families walked in the park, children laughed as they ran to the swings, and neighbors exchanged friendly greetings on their way to the market. The sun cast a golden glow on everything around, making the city almost picturesque. But for Lucas, this day was not just a day off. He had a goal: to buy the perfect birthday gift for his little sister Bia. Lucas saved for months by working overtime at a local diner, carefully setting aside every tip and paycheck to buy something special. He finally found the perfect gift: a silver bracelet with pendants from the jewelry store Charm, the most prestigious in the city. He passed by it countless times, pressing his nose against the window, imagining how Bia's eyes would shine when he saw it. Today was that very day. He clutched the purse in his pocket, reassured by the weight of the money inside. It wasn't just a purchase. It was a symbol of his love, everything he wanted to give her, despite the difficulties his family was facing. As he approached the store, immaculate glass windows sparkled in the sunlight, reflecting the busy streets behind him. He hesitated for a moment, adjusting his sweatshirt even though it was unbuttoned, revealing a carefully ironed polo shirt underneath. He was well aware of the reaction of some people at the sight of a young black guy in a sweatshirt. He dismissed the thought. Not today, he thought. Just go in, buy a bracelet, and leave. Taking a deep breath, he opened the heavy glass door, and a soft melody resounded through the store. Inside the Charm jewelry store, everything was as he had expected. Elegant glass displays, velvet shelves, and rows of sparkling gold and silver under bright, almost blinding lights. The light aroma of expensive perfume and polished wood filled the air. The customers inside were mostly well-dressed elderly women with diamond rings who caught the light while they admired the necklaces and earrings worth more than Lucas had earned in his entire life. He ignored their curious glances, focusing on the bracelet he had come to get. Behind the counter stood Patricia, a middle-aged white woman with carefully styled blonde hair and sharp, calculating eyes. Her expression was neutral at first, but the moment her eyes landed on Lucas, something in her posture changed. Her lips tightened into a thin line, her hand on the counter tightened a little, and her eyes, previously bored, now contained an unmistakable gaze of scrutiny. Lucas immediately sensed the change. That silent but deafening question that was always in the air when people like her looked at people like him. "What are you doing here?" Lucas had seen that look before, felt the weight of suspicion that clung to him like an invisible chain whenever he walked into places where people thought he didn't belong. But he refused to let that stop him. He walked up to the counter with a polite smile, pointing to the bracelet displayed in the window. "I would like to see this one, please," he said. His voice was firm, calm, as his mother had always taught him to speak when dealing with such people. Patricia, however, did not move. She simply crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. "Are you sure?" she asked in a voice full of condescension. "It's quite expensive." Lucas's stomach tightened, but he forced himself to keep a neutral expression. He put his hand in his pocket, pulling out his wallet, revealing the neatly folded money he had worked so hard to earn. "I'm sure," he said firmly. "I have money here." Patricia's eyes turned to the money, her lips curled slightly, as if the sight of them offended her. But instead of calming down, she seemed to become even more tense. Her fingers twitched next to the phone that was on the counter. She didn't move to pick up the bracelet. Instead, she let out a quiet, almost cheerful laugh. "And where exactly did you get all that money?" she asked, her voice casual, but the accusation behind him was razor-sharp. Lucas tensed. "Excuse me?" he asked, although he already knew where it was leading. Patricia raised an eyebrow. "It's just a lot of money for someone your age," she said, not taking her eyes off him. "Do you know you borrowed from someone? Maybe I found it somewhere?" Lucas's jaw clenched. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I work at Z's diner," he said, carefully pronouncing every word. "I've been saving up for this." Patricia made a soft sound of disbelief as she shook her head slightly. She muttered, tapping her fingers on the counter. And you expect me to believe it? Lucas swallowed the anger rising in his throat. Yes, he said dryly. Patricia let out a dry laugh as if she had heard a particularly ridiculous joke. Well, I suppose I should be flattered that you think you can deceive me, she said, finally moving towards the window. But I've been working here for a long time, boy. I know when things don't add up. Lucas's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He forced himself to unclench them. It had to be simple. He did not come here to be humiliated. Can I just look at the bracelet, please? He asked, his patience wearing thin. Patricia sighed as if he was bothering her, but she finally took out a velvet tray and placed it on the counter. Be careful with him, she warned in a harsh tone. It's worth more than you probably make in a year. Lucas gritted his teeth but said nothing. He stretched out his hand, carefully taking the bracelet, feeling the cold silver on his fingertips. He was perfect, exactly as he imagined. But when he turned it slightly, admiring the way the pendants wobbled, the smooth metal slipped from his fingers. The bracelet fell on the glass counter with a slight thud that echoed across the tiled floor. The moment it happened, Lucas's breath got stuck in his throat. Before he could move to pick it up, Patricia let out a high-pitched, sharp scream. "Oh my God, I knew it!" she shouted, her voice slicing through the store like a siren. All the heads in the room turned to them. Lucas's eyes widened. "Wait," he began. Patricia pointed her finger at him, her face contorted with indignation. "I knew you were up to something," she shouted. "You were going to steal it, weren't you? Thought you could get away with it?" Lucas's stomach dropped. "No," he tried to say. Patricia rushed to the store's phone, feverishly dialing the number. "Call the police immediately," she shouted into the phone. "We have a thief here. A dark-skinned guy in a sweatshirt is trying to steal." Lucas froze in place. The weight of her words fell on him like a locomotive. Silence reigned in the room, but the air was filled with something heavy. Condemnation, suspicion, fear. He felt each client's gaze pierce him, their postures change, the woman gripping her purse tighter, a little stronger. His mind was screaming for him to say something, to defend himself, but he knew that no one in that room would believe him, no more than she would believe her. Then, in the distance, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the air. The sirens grew louder, a frightening sound cut through the once calm day. Lucas could feel his pulse pounding against his ribs as the weight of the moment crashed down on him. He knew it could happen. He had seen it on the news, in whispered conversations, in the fear that settled in his mother's voice whenever she reminded him to be careful when he left the house. But knowing that it can happen and experiencing it are two completely different things. His breath got stuck in his throat, his fingers clenched on the sides of his body. Every instinct was screaming for him to move, to run, to fight against the blatant lies coming out of Patricia's mouth. But he didn't do any of that. He stood motionless, forcing himself to breathe, because anything else, any sudden movement, any inappropriate word could worsen the situation. Patricia's voice was shrill and authoritative as she spoke on the phone, her free hand still clinging to the counter as if she were a victim of it all. "Yes, right now. I need the cops at the charm jewelry shop immediately. He's still here. He's trying to deny, but I caught him red-handed," she said, keeping her eyes on Lucas. And as if in prayer, she added, lowering her voice enough to sound urgently, "He's getting aggressive." Lucas's stomach turned over. Aggressive? He barely spoke, didn't even move. She was painting a picture that everyone in the room was more than willing to believe. He could feel it by the way the other customers backed away. Their eyes shifted from him to Patricia. None of them questioned her words. A woman in a flowery dress pressed her purse closer. The old man in the suit shook his head, as if it was just confirmation of what he already assumed to be true. Lucas swallowed as he looked at the bracelet on the floor, the same one that had slipped from his fingers just moments ago, now a symbol of something far more dangerous. He took a deep breath and looked into Patricia's eyes. "I didn't steal anything," he said in a controlled voice but with barely contained fury. "You know that." Patricia grinned, crossing her arms. "Ah, please don't pretend to be innocent now. I thought you could get away with it, didn't you? But I know your type." She spat out the last words with barely concealed contempt, her gaze shifting to his hoodie, jeans, and sneakers he was wearing. "You walk in here, you look around as if you belong to this place, but the moment I look away, you think you can help yourself. I see it all the time." Lucas felt something inside him break, something cold and sharp and suffocating. He wanted to scream, to tell her how wrong she was, how disgusting, how mean, but the words stuck in his throat. It wouldn't matter. Nothing he said would have mattered, because in Patricia's eyes, in the eyes of everyone who watched, he was already guilty. The glass door of the store opened with a gust of air and 2 uniformed police officers entered the room. The energy changed, crackling like a bare wire. The conversation stopped instantly, and suddenly all eyes turned to Lucas. "It's him!" cried Patricia, pointing at him as if he were a wanted criminal. "It's him! He tried to steal from me!" Lucas barely had time to react before one of the policemen, a tall and burly man with gray hair and a badge that read Sergeant Pedro, took a step toward him, already handcuffing him. "Sir, I need you to put your hands where I can see them," he said. Lucas's breath got stuck in his throat. His fingers clenched to the sides of his body, but he didn't move. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to run, to defend himself, but he forced himself to stand still. Pedro's voice intensified. "I said hands are where I can see them." "I didn't do anything," Lucas said in a voice firmer than he felt. Patricia let out an exaggerated laugh. "Are you going to stand there and argue after I caught you? After he—" She gestured uncontrollably towards the bracelet on the floor. "Tried to steal it in front of your eyes?" Lucas shuddered. "You." The second policeman, a younger man with a sharp eye, Officer Carlos, hesitated. His gaze shifted between Lucas, Patricia, and the abandoned bracelet. Unlike Pedro, he didn't move immediately. Lucas noticed a glimmer of doubt in his expression. Carlos wasn't completely convinced, but it didn't matter. Pedro was already approaching with handcuffs ready, his face unwavering. "Son, I need you to come out," Pedro said. Lucas could feel his pulse pounding in his temples. His breathing was shallow, his mind going through the worst possible scenarios, and everyone ended the same way. He was on the ground, someone screaming, a headline beginning with the words, "Black teen arrested after attempted robbery." He knew how these stories ended. Patricia's smile widened, her arms crossed even tighter on her chest, her posture relaxed. "I think you've played enough," she gasped, forcing her voice to remain calm. "Call my mother." Pedro grinned, shaking his head. "Boy, you can make your call at the station." "No," Lucas said more firmly now, his voice echoing through the store. "Call my mother, now!" Patricia rolled her eyes. "Oh, of course, let him call Mommy," she said sarcastically. "And who is she? Public defender? Activist? What is she going to do, tell you to scream for justice?" Lucas ignored her. He put his hand in his pocket, not quickly or suddenly, just enough to pull out his phone. He dialed the number with firm hands. "Mom, I need you to come to the Charm Jewelry store right now." Pedro's eyebrows furrowed slightly, but he still didn't look worried. Carlos, however, has changed. He must have noticed something in Lucas's voice, the way he didn't beg or beg, the way he didn't panic despite the danger he was in. No, Lucas wasn't afraid. He waited. The minutes dragged on like hours. The air in the store was thick, the tension palpable. Patricia tapped her foot impatiently. Pedro sighed, his hand on the handcuffs only slightly weakening. Carlos checked his watch. Customers had already retreated, whispering among themselves. Some took out their phones. Then the door opened. A woman came in, tall and imposing, with a presence that silenced the whole room. A dark blue suit hugged her body, her heels tapping on the tiles with determination, and her sharp eyes, much like Lucas's, scanned the stage in front of her. She held up the badge, displaying it with authority that left no room for doubt. "I'm Dr. Simona Castro," she announced, her voice cutting through the room like steel. "Chief of Police of the Happy Village." She turned her gaze to Pedro and said, gesturing towards Lucas, "This is my son." The room fell into a long, agonizing silence. The store fell silent. The weight of Simone Castro's words weighed on everyone in the room, suffocating and inevitable. Lucas could hardly breathe as he watched the recognition appear on the faces of the policemen. Pedro tensed first, his grip on the handcuffs loosened, his body suddenly becoming less confident, not so dominant. Carlos, who was already showing hesitation, exhaled, his posture changing in such a way that suggested that he was carefully calculating his next move. But it was Patricia who reacted most violently. Her expression twisted, her smile disappearing in an instant, replaced by something ugly, shock, anger, despair. She blinked hard, as if hoping she had misheard, as if refusing to accept that this dark-skinned young man whom she had so easily condemned was the son of a woman superior to everyone in the room. Her mouth opened and closed, then opened again. "Simone," she stuttered, her voice no longer carrying the same venom, now mixed with something dangerously close to panic. Simone did not look at her. Her eyes remained on Pedro, piercing, unmoved. "Sergeant, I suppose you have a reasonable explanation for why my son is surrounded here while you handcuff without even asking a single question," she said. Pedro changed his position. His jaw tightened, his hands slowly lowered, but he did not let go of the handcuffs completely. "We've received a call for an attempted theft," he began, his voice harsh, defensive. "We reacted accordingly." Simone tilted her head slightly, squinting her eyes. "Did you react accordingly? And by correspondingly, do you mean going in here after seeing a black boy and immediately deciding that he is guilty?" Pedro tensed. "This is not what really happened," he said. "Really?" said Simone coldly. "Because it seems very similar to it to me." Patricia finally found her voice, and it exploded with the sharpness of someone desperately trying to regain control. "I called because he was trying to steal from me," she blurted out, pointing at Lucas, her voice rising. "He dropped the bracelet and was clearly going to take it. I stopped him in time, and I did what any responsible citizen would do. I called the police before he could run away with my goods." Simone exhaled slowly, her gaze shifting to Lucas for the first time since she had arrived. He did not move, did not speak, did not even try to explain himself. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said it all, the anger boiling just beneath his carefully restrained surface, the tiredness, the frustration, the knowledge that even as the son of one of the highest-ranking police officers in the city, he was still seen as nothing more than a suspect. She turned to Pedro. "Have you checked the security camera footage?" Pedro hesitated. "We were going to—" "No, you didn't mean to," Simone interrupted gently, deadly. "You were going to arrest him without analyzing any evidence, without interrogation, without doing your job." Her voice was soft, but the authority in it was deafening. Carlos swallowed, looking at his boss and at Simone. His hesitations had been evident before, but now that the weight of the situation was completely weighing on him, they had turned into something tangible. "We have to check the recordings," Carlos interjected, his voice cautious, controlled, but tinged with remorse. Pedro's eyes turned to him, an unspoken betrayal, but he couldn't argue. Not now, not with the one who stood in front of them. He took a deep breath through his nose, his jaw tightening. "All right," he said angrily. Patricia's face twisted in disbelief. "No, I said what happened. Are you going to listen to her?" She gestured uncontrollably towards Simone, then Lucas, her voice full of the same contempt she had been carrying all along. "You saw him. You saw how he acted. It's ridiculous." Simone finally turned completely to Patricia, and at that moment, the weight of her gaze itself silenced the older woman. Patricia's courage diminished under the silent intensity of the police chief's gaze, as if she had suddenly realized that any power she thought she had at that moment was slipping through her fingers like sand. "Mrs. Patricia," Simone said, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through steel. "Let me explain something very, very clearly to you." She took a slow, deliberate step forward. "You are standing in front of a young man who has entered the store to buy a bracelet for his sister. A young man who saved his own hard-earned money to support your business. A young man whom you immediately called a thief because you decided, before he even spoke, that he did not belong here." She let the words hang in the air, let them sink, wrap around Patricia's throat like an ever-tighter rope. "So, I hope, for your own good, that the security camera footage will tell the story that you claim they will tell, because if not—" Her lips tightened into a thin, deadly line. "You will answer for every word you say." Patricia swallowed, her bravado cracking at the edges. Pedro cleared his throat, awkwardly changing his position. "Let's check the cameras," he said. The store manager, who was frozen in the background, too stunned to intervene, hurried to the back, retrieving the records. They were shown on a small screen behind the counter. The silent recording showed the exact sequence of events. Lucas enters the store, talks to Patricia, hands over the money, the moment when the bracelet slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor. Everything was there, every second. No theft, no putting it in your pocket, no crime, just a 17-year-old boy trying to buy a gift. The silence that followed was suffocating. Carlos sighed, rubbing his face with his hand. Pedro looked as if he had swallowed something bitter, his jaw clenched with pent-up disappointment. Patricia looked as if the earth had been ripped from under her feet. Simone took a deep breath before speaking again, her tone dangerously soft. "So, tell me, Sergeant, what's going on now? Do you still want to arrest my son?" Pedro said nothing. He knew it was better. Simone turned to Patricia, her expression unreadable. "And you," she continued, tilting her head slightly, "will you tell me what you were so sure of?" Patricia's lips quivered. She looked from Simone to Lucas, then to the cops, then to the clients, who were now watching with a mixture of shock, discomfort, and, in some cases, silent satisfaction. Her voice broke. She had no defense, no excuse, only the realization that she had acted too confidently, too recklessly, and lost. Simone nodded slowly and understandingly. "That's exactly what I thought." Pedro cleared his throat, straightening his shoulders. "Ma'am," he said to Simone, his voice strained, "I think we're done here." She raised an eyebrow. "No apologies?" Pedro's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Patricia, however, opened her mouth, still looking for a way to save the situation, but there was nothing more to say. Simone exhaled, turning to Lucas. "Come along, dear," she muttered. "We're leaving." Lucas didn't move at first. He just stood there, looking at Patricia, Pedro, at the destruction of what had just happened. He wanted to feel relief, victory, justice, but all he felt was fatigue, because no matter how many times he won such battles, the war never ended. He exhaled, shaking his head, and finally turned to follow his mother to the door. As he passed Patricia, he met her gaze for the last time. "I just wanted to buy a bracelet," he said, his voice calm but firm, the weight of everything that had happened hanging behind his words. "But I think I got something more valuable instead." With that, he walked out with his head held high, his back straight, while Patricia remained frozen, watching the life she had previously controlled crumble at her feet. As Lucas and Simone walked out of the charm jewelry store, the heavy glass door closed behind them. The tension inside the store remained thick, sticking to the air like the aftermath of a storm. The moment should have felt like a victory, a moment of undeniable justice, but when Lucas took a breath of fresh afternoon air, his chest still felt tight, his stomach still knotted. Something raw and unresolved. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his fingers aching from how hard he had clenched them since Patricia had accused him. His mother walked beside him, her presence firm and unwavering, but he could feel a pent-up rage emanating from her in waves. Simone did not speak at first. Her steps were resolute, her heels tapped loudly on the asphalt. It wasn't until they approached her car, parked a short distance, that she finally turned to him with an unreadable expression on her face. "Are you okay?" she asked in a measured voice, but there was something even deeper than anxiety in it, something charged with the kind of exhaustion that only comes from fighting the same battle over and over again. Lucas sighed slowly, looking back at the store through the window. He could still see Patricia standing stiff and motionless behind the counter, her face pale, her eyes returning to the cops as if she were looking for the last lifeline. Pedro's jaw was tight, and Carlos seemed to be somewhere between relief and embarrassment. The store manager, who had been too cowardly to intervene, now seemed to want to disappear. Clients who had previously been willing to judge avoided eye contact, suddenly wondering about anything but the consequences of their tacit complicity. "I don't know," Lucas finally admitted, running his hand over his face. "I have to feel better. I have to feel like I've proven that I've won." Simone studied him for a long time, then exhaled, softening her features a little. "Son, you didn't have to prove anything in the first place." The words struck him more than he had expected. His jaw clenched and he swallowed the lump that had formed in his throat. "This," he muttered in a heavy voice. "I know." For a long time they stood there, the weight of everything hanging between them. Then the door of the charm jewelry store opened again, and Lucas's eyes caught sight of Patricia coming out, his whole body tensed. Patricia hesitated, her hand gripping the handle of the bag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She seemed different now, less, in a sense, devoid of the confidence and superiority that she had so easily carried before. Her face was hard, her lips tightly pressed together, as if she was waging an internal war. It was clear that she wanted to say something she had been arguing about in the moments since the security camera footage had exposed her. Lucas's heart pounded wildly in his ears as he waited. Patricia took one step forward, then another, then opened her mouth and closed it again. Her throat moved, her eyes turned to Simone, then to Lucas again. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, She took a deep breath and shook her head. Her expression changed to something like wounded and pitiful pride. She began, but no words came. She did not apologize, did not admit that she was wrong, just turned away. Lucas let out a sharp and joyless chuckle. "This is what I expected," Simone grinned, crossing her arms. "Cowards never know how to say they're sorry." Lucas watched Patricia disappear down the sidewalk with a stiff posture, a quick gait, as if she was trying to run away from the consequences of her own actions. He should have expected, should have known that people like her would never truly face what they had done, never acknowledge the damage they had caused, but it still hurt. Pedro and Carlos followed him out of the store. Carlos glanced at them briefly before looking away, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Pedro, on the other hand, barely glanced at them. He simply nodded towards Simone, tacitly acknowledging that he had lost this battle, and then turned around, marching towards his patrol car. "Is that all?" said Lucas, exhaling slowly. "For now," Simone replied. Lucas turned to the charm jewelry store once more. Inside, the clients went back to browsing as if nothing had happened, as if a few minutes ago they weren't standing watching as a black teenager was accused of a crime he didn't commit, waiting to see what would happen to him. He clenched his jaw, then shook his head. "I just wanted to buy a bracelet," he muttered. Simone sighed, reaching out to squeeze his shoulder. "I know, honey." Lucas took a deep breath, then exhaled, his shoulders finally relaxed, albeit slightly. He walked away from Patricia's shop, from the weight of everything that had just happened, and headed for the car. Justice was done, but the battle was not over, never for real. As the car door closed behind him, Lucas leaned back in his seat, exhaling heavily. The weight of everything that had just happened had settled deep in his bones, exhaustion running through his muscles. Simone sat down beside him in silence, her hands resting on the steering wheel, her nails digging into her skin in the form of a barely perceptible crescent. The whirring of the engine filled the quiet space between them, but none of them moved, none of them spoke. Outside, the world continued to live as if nothing had happened. People passed by, cars drove into parking spaces, the sky remained the same indifferent shade of blue, but inside, Lucas could still feel the heat of Patricia's accusation clinging to his skin, the condemnation in the eyes of those who stood and watched, doing nothing. Simone finally broke the silence. Her voice was softer now, without the harsh authority she displayed inside the store. It was different. It was a mother talking to her son, not a police chief demanding accountability. Lucas looked at the dashboard, his fingers tapping lightly on his jeans. "I don't know," he admitted in a hoarse voice. "I feel angry and tired, and it's like none of that matters, because tomorrow there will be someone else in my shoes, and no one will stop to ask if they're okay." Simone took a deep breath, her hands clenched on the steering wheel before she forced herself to relax. "I know," she muttered. "This is a cycle that keeps repeating itself. But today we fought. Today you did not let them break you." Lucas let out a bitter chuckle. No, he did not allow it. I just stood there listening to this woman talk about me like I was nothing, while everyone else just let it happen. And even when she was caught, even when she knew she was wrong, she still couldn't say those words. He turned to Simone, his disappointment burning in his eyes. "How do you deal with something so deep? How do you get people to see you as a person when they've already decided that you're not?" Simone did not answer immediately. She was looking ahead, her lips tightly pressed into a solid line. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but unwavering. "Refusing to let them define you. Making sure that no matter what they see when they look at you, you know who you are. Showing them over and over again that they are wrong, even when they refuse to admit it." Lucas clenched his jaw as he stared out the window. This is not enough. It never seems enough. But maybe that was all they had. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it was different, heavier, more settled. Simone then reached into her purse, pulling out her cell phone. Lucas frowned as she scrolled through the contacts before tapping on the name and holding the device to her ear. "Who are you talking to?" he asked suspiciously. She didn't answer right away, instead waited with an unreadable expression on her face while the line rang. After a pause, she spoke. "Cynthia, I need to prepare a press release immediately." "Yes, about the jewelry store Charm." She looked at Lucas before continuing. "I want a full investigation into the call that was made to the control room, and I want an internal check of Sergeant Pedro." I also want a public statement about racial discrimination and the misuse of emergency services, and make sure the media knows exactly what happened today." Lucas's eyes widened slightly. "Will you really go after them?" he asked. Simone took the phone from her ear, giving him a look of complicity. "Do you think I'm going to leave it like that?" she replied. Lucas exhaled, and something between relief and disbelief settled in his chest. He spent so much time watching stories like this unfold in the same way. Someone is discriminated against, humiliated, blamed, and then, even when the truth comes out, nothing changes. But this, it seemed different. It seemed like a struggle that didn't end the moment they walked out of the store. He nodded slowly, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. "Excellent." Simone returned to the phone conversation. "And Cynthia, make sure Patricia's name is included in the release. If she thought she could get away with it, she was wrong." Lucas exhaled slowly, looking down at his hands. Maybe justice is not always immediate. Maybe it doesn't come in an apology package. But sometimes justice looks like a responsibility, and this time, I didn't have to bear that burden alone. 3 days later, the charm jewelry store was everywhere. News broadcasts broadcast segments about the incident, social media exploded with indignation, and the store's Yelp page was flooded with 1-star ratings. Patricia was placed on indefinite leave, although there were rumors that she was actually fired. An official statement condemning racial discrimination was issued, and an internal investigation was launched against Sergeant Pedro after body camera footage showed how quickly he moved to detain Lucas without evidence. Lucas scrolled through the news articles on his phone, barely remembering the words. He had to feel like a winner. Instead, all he could think about was how things could have been different if his mother hadn't been who she was, if Carlos hadn't hesitated, if there had been no cameras. How different would his story have been? His thoughts were interrupted by a small shout of joy. "Lucas! Lucas! Look what my mother gave me!" He barely had time to look back before Bia plopped down on the sofa next to him, her hand outstretched with pride. The silver charm bracelet shone in the living room light, the small pendant swaying as she waved her hand excitedly. Lucas's chest tightened. "Did you like it?" asked Lucas. Bia smiled. "Are you kidding? He's perfect." She tilted her head, frowning slightly. "But I thought you were going to buy it." Lucas hesitated. His mother had apparently bought the bracelet for him, making sure that his sister would still receive her birthday present no matter what. But the thought of stepping into that store again, seeing Patricia's face, being surrounded by the weight of this moment, was too great. "I chose," he said, forcing a smile. "That's what matters, right?" Bia smiled, nodding her head. She hugged his hands in a quick hug before running away to show it to her mom again. Lucas exhaled as he watched her walk away. Maybe it wasn't the perfect ending. Maybe there will never be a perfect ending. But at that moment, Bia was happy, and so far, it was enough. Join us to share incredible stories by liking and subscribing to our channel. Don't forget to activate the notification bell to start your day with in-depth lessons and genuine empathy.